Welcome, everybody. I see a few people I don't know, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Dan Fagan, the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, SHERP, here at the Carter Institute at NYU. And this is our second Inside Out session of the semester, our 41st overall, right? Or maybe 42nd, I can't remember. I'll let Lee formally introduce our guest, but I'll just say that Jennifer came all the way from LA to be with us today, which is a really awesome thing for her to do. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm really excited to hear from Jennifer because she is a very engaging writer and she makes very dry subjects really fun and also engaging not just in a shallow way, but in a deeper way. So it's a pleasure to have her, and it's a distinct pleasure to introduce Lee Hotz, a distinguished writer-in-residence here at the Carter Institute, and the science columnist for the Wall Street Journal. So take it away, Professor Hotz.
Thank you, thank you. You know, I'm seeing an interesting gravitational effect of wine and cheese here. You know, the whole room is tilting. The whole room is tilting. It's an experiment in cocktail party physics, really. Yeah. So, thank you all. Welcome. This is Inside Out. As Dan said, this is our second session of the spring in our masterclass seminar on science journalism. And I just, up front, I should say that on March 22nd, we'll continue this spring conversation with, we'll sit down with Joe Palca, the natural science correspondent for National Public Radio. And then on April 5th, we're having what I'm expecting to be a really intriguing conversation with Columbia University surgeon and medical writer Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is the author of the, one of the most well-regarded medical books of the publishing season, Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. It's a very interesting way of approaching a long-form narrative at a very tricky but compelling topic. But tonight, what we want to do is go to the wellspring of science and journalism, and science communications. And we want to kind of visit for a bit with Jennifer Ouellette and explore the intersection of words and form and technique and media technology and story that go into successful science writing. I mean, it's a truism these days that our craft in the publishing industry that supports it's in turmoil. I mean, it's true turmoil when I was starting out, it was turmoil when I was in mid-career, and it's in turmoil now, and each time it's for a different reason. But right now we're being driven by technological changes that on the one hand are deconstructing a lot of our traditional platforms, but they're also offering us opportunities for new avenues. Those of you who joined us last time heard from Mike Haney, former executive editor of Popular Science, who's at the forefront of designing a new wave of publishing apps, self-publishing apps for the iPad and other tablet platforms that may turn us all into our own publishing magnets, small m. Each of us comes to this craft from a different vantage point and in a different way. And it just does seem a good thing this evening to reacquaint ourselves a little bit with the reasons why we write, and especially why we've taken up science as a subject. Do we write to educate? Do we write to listen, to inform? Do we write to entertain? Do we write just to pay the rent? Each time that we sit down before our terminal to tweet, to blog, to draft a magazine article, to do a book proposal, it's a thought experiment in the fundamentals of science communication. And so in that spirit, we're going to be talking tonight with a writer who works at the intersection of science and popular culture, of science journalism and science communication, which are allied, but not always the same thing. And we want to have a conversation here, which I want to encourage you all to join, to interrupt, to question, to become part of, about the many ways that we can tell the science's story, the story of science, and do it as a form of performance art, which is really, I think, Jennifer's specialty. So Jennifer Ouellette, who flew from LA to be with us this evening, is the author of 3 popular science books, most recently the Calculus Diaries, How Math Can Help You Lose Weight, Win at Vegas, and Survive a Zombie Apocalypse. She writes for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Discover, Salon, Nature, Physics World, The New Scientist, among others. She is the impresario of a well-regarded science blog called Cocktail Party Physics, which has a wide-ranging set of subjects. There are 5, 6 of you, I guess, who work on the blog. I should say it features, among other things, a very interesting set of recipes for cocktails, science cocktails, including one, I believe, called the Quantum, is it, wait a minute, I'll find it here, because it's worth noting. The Quantum Theory, yes, here we go. The Quantum Theory. Now this contains rum, Strega, Grand Marnier, and pineapple juice. And it's guaranteed, so I'm informed, to collapse your wave function. She also tweets, and interestingly, not as herself, but in a persona, which we'll talk about in a little bit. She freelances magazine writers, and she is also, as we said, a writer of at least 3 books. I believe she has another in the works at the moment. But what's interesting about what Jennifer does is how she has used these different technological publishing platforms, these things that we're all obsessed with in the social networking world, as ways to sort of develop a voice, build herself as a character as a writer, and then turn that to very well-received narratives at the hard spot of what we do. You know, this is not molecular biology, this is not nice stuff about snow leopards, but at the hard core of math and physics. And I want to start the conversation here now by just reading you an excerpt, because it's hard to explain what somebody does at this thing, so I'm just going to read this to you here. That evening finds me unwinding from the day's exertions over a refreshing tropical cocktail. I should tell you, this is a book about calculus. Already the cocktails are coming in. At a refreshing tropical cocktail in the hotel's outdoor bar. The sun is setting, casting a pinkish-orange glow over the water as hotel staff readies for the night's luau performance. I find myself listening to the rhythmic cycle of waves crashing on the shore and reflecting on the fact that I can hear these waves because my brain is performing Fourier transforms constantly. It's an essential part of how we hear. The brain senses the incoming pressure wave and performs a Fourier transform on that signal to identify the frequency and amplitude of the sound. The ear measures change in pressure as a function of time. Sometimes it's a single note, sometimes it's several notes together, as in a musical chord in each case. The brain uses the Fourier transform to determine which components made up the total sound wave. Similarly, every time we gaze at a sunset and identify specific hues, a spectacular orange-red or a more subtle pinkish glow, our brain has taken a Fourier transform to isolate specific frequencies of light. And when a surfer eyeballs incoming ocean waves, his or her brain is making similar calculations. The Fourier transform has a personal significance as well. Shortly after becoming engaged, Sean, currently her husband, and I drove from a conference in San Francisco to our new home in Los Angeles via the scenic route along the Pacific Coast Highway. At sunset, we stopped briefly to refuel just north of Malibu and found ourselves admiring the brilliant orange, red, and purple hues stretching across the darkening horizon, savoring the peaceful sound of waves lapping against the shore. Oh, it was the perfect romantic setting to cap off a long day's drive. Sean is nothing if not romantic. He is also the quintessential physicist, Well, he put his arms around me and whispered, "Wouldn't it be fascinating to make a Fourier transform of those waves?" So this is a very distinct voice, and I think what we'd like to do is start by kind of talking about how you got to this particular point in your writing career. And you are very proud of describing yourself as a recovering English major. In fact, you have no science background in a classic sense,
No.
and you come to this in the way that many readers do, clothed in your ignorance.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
You know, the universe has a sense of humor, I like to say, because I kind of avoided all math and science classes for a very long time. But when I was living in New York City and I was trying to make a living as a writer, it turns out that one of the organizations or groups of people that would hire me was a physics organization. And it was
The
American Physical Society,
Right.
yes. I owe them my career because it had never occurred to me that being a science writer was even something I could do. I think I've always been a storyteller. Ever since I was a kid, I was always making up little stories and things like that. And I minored in journalism and edited my college newspaper. So there's always been a storytelling aspect to what I do. But I'd always been kind of afraid of science, and physics in particular, that's the scariest one. But when I started writing for the American Physical Society, I saw it from a different perspective. I think most of us experience something like physics in a high school classroom, where you're learning probably the most dry, boring stuff that's in physics. You're learning about the slope of the inclined plane, and you're doing calculus problems to, figure out the amplitude of a sine wave, and it doesn't occur to you that this is going to be in any way useful or relevant to your life. When you see it being done in the real world, the stories jump out at you, the personalities, the people. So I would go and write these stories for various science magazines, and the articles themselves were fairly dry and fairly technical, but I would get to visit the lab and I'd end up chatting with the
So
scientists.
you're writing for an audience, in this case, of other physicists,
I
right?
started out writing for other physicists, which is a very different audience, and we can talk a little bit about how you change your level of diction.
And they didn't notice, you didn't know what you were talking about?
Well, here's the thing. You actually need to know more science to write for a general audience than to write for a highly technical one, because certain things just don't need to be defined. I've always been very good at vocabulary, so I picked up the vocabulary very, very quickly. And
You studied languages? I mean, what the...
No, I've just been very good with vocab. And to me, I realized right away that the concepts were pretty straightforward. What I did have, because I didn't get caught up in all the technical jargon and all the technical details, I had an ability to say, here are the salient points that I want to emphasize, and then I'll pick a few things to flesh out a little bit more in the story, which can be a little difficult. If you know too much about a subject, it can be difficult to see the forest for the trees. And I learned to use that to my advantage. But I did have to do a lot of extra work. I ended up having to, spend extra time doing research and ask, for definitions and, look things up and do a lot of extra work while I was learning that. Less so now, because after doing this 15, 20 years, I actually have acquired, believe it or not, a pretty good physics background. The whole time I was going through this, I was also sending emails and letters and things to friends, telling them funny stories from the lab and, cracking jokes and painting these vivid portraits of the scientists. And finally, a physicist friend of mine said, he goes, don't take this the wrong way. He says, but your emails are way better than your articles. He goes, and your articles are fine. It's just that, you have such a distinctive voice and there's all these stories and nobody gets to hear these stories. People think physics is so dry and boring and you make it come alive. Could you maybe write about physics using that voice? And I thought, I say today it was probably the best advice I ever got, because I really started thinking about it. At the time, there really wasn't a market for that in traditional science writing and covering physics. The I voice was not allowed. Really was not allowed.
Well, how would you characterize the style? I mean, what?
It was just you wanted straight reportage. You wanted explication of the facts and that sort of thing, and you wanted a fairly straightforward account. And if you did a narrative, it would be you would not inject yourself. The literary journalism movement had not yet come to science writing. I think at least not in the physics outlets that I was writing for. when I did occasionally try and attempt to do some of that, it tended to get cut in favor of the more technical details. Again, it's a question of audience. So then I started experimenting with transferring some of that personal voice and some of that storytelling and some of that narrative structure and characterization, and it transformed my writing, I think. That's when I started writing for much more general audiences, and writing for things like Discover and Salon. And
So when you say experimenting, okay, I'm sort of back, you're writing for physicists and you don't have to define any of your words, but you're writing funny emails to friends. So what do you mean experimenting with your voice? What are you talking about?
I actually just started transferring some of the stuff I was writing in the emails and working some of that into the story. If there was
what kind of thing are we talking about?
A funny story about, say, visiting a lab of Federico Capasso at Bell Labs, who had invented the quantum cascade laser, and basically telling the story of what it was like when he let me hold it. And we think of lasers as being, you know, these huge Dr. Evil kinds of, you know, sharks with frickin' laser beams on top of their heads kind of thing. But in fact, the laser itself, the laser fit on my fingertip, which was amazing to me. The stuff that takes up all the room is the contraptions to control the light beam and control the laser. The lasing element, the laser itself, is absolutely tiny. And that was a revelation to me. And it translated very well to a general audience because, again, most of us have seen lasers from the movies and we see these big herkin things and we think that's a laser, and it's not. Working that into a story about quantum cascade lasers gave it a very vibrant personal narrative element. Does that answer your question?
Oh, sort of. Because see, now I'm trying to understand now. So you're writing very technical stuff for a very technical audience. And you are, the next thing one knows, sort of writing a book about the history of physics. So that's kind of a jump I'm not really clear on how you make. I mean, I know some of us who come to the table with clothed in our ignorance, you know, there's some very traditional forms that you go for. Oh, I'm going to write a profile of the heroic scientist who's making the tiny laser. I'm going to...
Which I was very good at profiling, and I think it started with that. But I also got involved, very interested in history of physics. I was a former English major, and one of the things that you do...
You're a former English major. Did you have to give your degree back? I mean, what...
I don't know. I don't know. They might want...
They strip it from you?
They might actually, yes.
Yeah.
Recovering English major.
Okay.
When I was studying English literature, one of the important things to do, I found, was to look at the context. Particularly if you're studying something from the 17th century, you want to look at the cultural context, the history surrounding that. You want to understand where that book came from and what it grew out of. And science in particular, I think this is very important because science builds on everything that came before. So I started writing a regular little column for this, a publication of the American Physical Society on just, 1,000 words each month on some little snippet of physics history. And my editor at the time, after about 3 years said, you've got enough here that you could probably collect them and rework them a bit and it could be a book. And that presents a very unique challenge because a lot of this information has been out for a while. There's a lot of physics history books out there.
Sure.
So I had the challenge of how am I going to make this fresh? How am I going to make this interesting? And I decided that I would try and bring these two worlds together. One of the things I think has really kind of saddens me about my earlier years is that I grew up buying into this notion of the two cultures, that because I was into the humanities, I couldn't be a science person. We tend to have most of our daily lives, most of our cultural stuff is over here, and then physics and science tends to be over here. And that they don't really come together very often. And so I thought, well, what if I just take the physics and put it right smack back in the culture? So I tried illustrating physics concepts with popular culture, with film, with television, with books, theater,
Okay, so
music.
now who's your audience for this? Because when you're writing for physicists, you don't need to do this.
Exactly, which is why I had to completely redo the columns, because the columns were initially...
So you did this as part of recycling the historical material from the columns into the book that eventually became
Black
Bodies and Quantum Cat's Tales from the annals of
And
physics.
that's when,
which
yeah,
was,
and that's when I really
2006,
had to
yeah.
start learning the physics. I could no longer just basically get the gist. I had to really start digging down and asking a lot of why is the sky blue questions. It wasn't enough for me to understand that this was happening. I had to understand why it was happening. Because if I didn't understand, for example, you know, why the uncertainty principle is true, if I don't understand that, you know, why it is so, then I can't break it down to explain to a general reader.
You actually, you think it's actually important for a science writer to actually know what he or she is talking about? I mean,
Yeah, I do.
And how did you engage in that second round of educating yourself? So now you've been dealing with these physicists as the representative of the American Physical Society, a very august group of.
It gave me unprecedented access to Nobel laureate physicists.
But weren't they shocked to discover you were
No, they knew my background. They
new
were
to the game? Put it that way?
No. They were actually shocked. Well, a couple people I think were shocked that I wasn't. They had read my features and thought that I was a physicist. A couple people did.
Mm-hmm.
But those who knew me, those who had watched me, you know, develop from day one, knew, you know, that I was, you know, they were amazed I could write about it at all, and they were very encouraging and very supportive. Like I said, I really do owe this organization my career, because they didn't kick me out because I was ignorant. They said, you actually are good at this. You can be even better, and we will help you be that. So I would come in with questions. I would basically draft something, and I would go in and meet with a particular physicist, Alan Chodos, who works for the American Physical Society. And he would sit me down in his office, and I would say, okay, I know this is true. It seems counterintuitive. Can you explain to me why this is so? And sometimes that required equations, which I was not happy about, but he did in fact force me to sit through the equations. And when you have someone walking you through the equation, it's actually not that bad. So he also is the one I think that helped me get over my math phobia, because he just said, no, look, you can understand this. Trust me, just be patient, let me walk you through it, and you're going to get this. And he was wonderful about that. I think the example I use in the Calculus Diaries, one of the first times he did this, all objects fall at the same rate, regardless of mass, at least at the broad classical scale. And
Yeah, see, at the Wall Street Journal, we'd have to say allegedly fall at the same time.
yeah, well, and you know, there is a footnote to that, which we can go into later, but because there's always a footnote. But it defies what we can see with our eyes, because when we drop, say, a feather in a coin, we see the coin fall first and the feather kind of float down. But our eyes are deceiving us. That is actually, nature is tricking us to a certain extent, because if you do that same experiment in a vacuum, and a very basic physics demonstration is to create a little container with a vacuum and perform that experiment, they really do, it's creepy, they fall at the same rate. And I'd seen this done, and I says, well, okay, why? And then he showed me the algebraic equation, you know, and what you have is the big M in the equation for the mass of the Earth, and then the little m, the mass of the object, and those little m's cancel out as you go through the derivation. And all you're left with is the mass of the Earth. And all that really tells you is the mass of whatever object it is just so minuscule and unimportant with relation to the mass of the Earth that it simply is irrelevant to your calculations. Until you get down to the quantum level.
So you're a wonderful explainer. And I want to explore that a little bit more in a minute, but I want to ask you a question first. So when you think about yourself now, I was just listening to you, do you think of yourself as a science journalist, or do you think of yourself as a science communicator?
Yeah.
And how are they different?
They are different.
Are they?
Yes, well, you know, it's interesting. This comes up a lot because I view my blog, Cocktail Party Physics, as science communication. I don't think it adheres to rigid, it's more of a free write. It's more that first draft you do when you're trying to figure things out. It's fun, it's kind of, you know, a little sloppy, to be perfectly honest. Single sourced sometimes, you know, or you know, no original, you know, reporting. It's really just my way of getting familiar with the topic. I don't consider that journalism, but I don't think it's not valuable. I think that it actually serves a very important purpose. So I would say that I'm both. I wear many different hats. And book author is in a completely different hat, you know, because in that, it is a little bit, because as a journalist, you're very much behind the scenes, particularly if you're doing straight news reporting or straight feature writing. You don't inject yourself. You stay behind the scenes. You're not really self-promoting that much. When you become an author, when you write a book, you have an obligation to promote that book, and suddenly you're thrust into the spotlight. Most of us became writers because we're shy, and I can say that's a very painful transition. And after a while, you get used to it, but I've had some really disastrous public appearances in my early years.
That's so interesting. I'd like to learn more, but I'll spare you.
Yeah.
But, okay, so you blog, and you also spend a lot of time tweeting. But to explore the sort of shy writer thing for a moment, you don't really blog or tweet as you, which is unusual. I mean, many people blog. Ivan blogs. Ivan has more blogs than I have apples. But they're authoritative. They're done with his persona, with his voice, with his gravitas, and it's the work of Ivan Oransky. You, on the other hand, wear masks.
Yeah.
What I mean is, I'm not sure I'll get the pronunciation correct, but your Twitter handle is not Ouellette or Hotz or whatever. It's Jean-Luc Piquant.
Yes.
And you have a voice of a kind of wise-mouthed French savant who says snarky, rude things to people.
Faux French. She's
Faux
very
French.
pretentious.
Pretentious faux French savant, and you are none of those things. The Cocktail Party Physics has a certain similar kind of framing. Again, it's not you, it's the cocktails, it's a this, it's a that, it's a funny thing. And the tone of the blog, even though, as you say, it's intentionally a first draft, it's got a whole kind of chatty, faux domesticity quality to it. I mean, what's going on there? Why are you doing that?
I didn't do that.
What's the point?
I did not actually do that deliberately. It started out as I started the blog, and a friend of mine said, they had these little avatars that you can put to kind of indicate mood and things like that. So Jean-Luc Piquant, I named her Jean-Luc Piquant. It was kind of a play on Jean-Luc Picard.
Right.
And she had a little beret and things like that.
Right.
There's different outfits that she has, with different moods. And over time, I started jokingly referring to her, and after a while, she kind of became her own character. And I think if you're a storyteller at all, these sorts of things happen. I mean, she ended up just becoming and developing a personality all her own. So there is a me in the blog post, and then she will sometimes come in with the snarkier comments that maybe I'm a little uncomfortable saying. If I really want to say something nasty and I think it's funny, I'll make her say it because it gives me a little distance.
So have these been sort of little developmental tools for you? I mean, one of the things that has struck me about your work in this arena, a lot of our colleagues, Carl Zimmer is kind of the great example, David Dobbs, will use social media, blogging, tweeting, to kind of cross-pollinate and promote things they're doing. They have a big piece coming out in Scientific American, and they'll refer to it or expand it or whatever. But the whole point is a kind of very straightforward brand building exercise. It seems that you're actually engaged in something different with these things. I mean, I'm sure that's a factor, but they look like ways that you're experimenting with writing techniques and with persona.
Right.
And your book stance is very much focused on a certain kind of persona, a certain kind of explanatory first person thing that you clearly weren't comfortable with when you started out. So I'm trying to understand how you evolved this.
It's interesting because I think, and maybe some of you can relate to this, a lot of what I struggled with early on as a writer was getting the hell out of my own way. We all know what this is like. I mean, you're writing the big important story, and you end up kind of getting bogged down with the weight of everything that you have to do in that story. So bringing a sense of play to it, bringing a free write, bringing a fun little persona and a sense of humor to it lightens it up for me. And the blog I view as my writing lab. In fact, I've called it that on more than one occasion. It's where I can experiment with form, with voice. I can invent this little avatar character, Jean-Luc Piquant, and I can try on these different voices and different personas. And it did a lot in terms of loosening up my writing. And it's also a good way to get to know a subject matter. If I want to, if a story comes up or I'm interested in a question, For example, someone gave us one of those little devices for wine called a venturi. I don't know if you need to know what this is. It's supposed to aerate wine, essentially, a lot faster than just leaving it out in the decanter. And had some physicists over. I'm married to a physicist, so they come over a lot now. You can't just have a device like that around physicists, and they're going to want to test it. So we ended up with like 4 bottles of wine, and we used all our glassware, and we ended up testing and doing this little taste test to see whether this little venturi actually worked. And I ended up writing a blog post about that.
And were you sober enough at the end of this to be able to tell that it worked? That's
No, in fact, one of our friends ended up crashing because he was not okay to drive.
And so you then blogged about this?
Not about him crashing,
but I mean,
we ended up doing a whole blog post on that, and then I did a follow-up post because the same venturi effect that aerates the wine also is why in your car, when you're pumping the gas, how your car tank, how the gas pump knows your car tank is full. It's got a sensor on it, and basically because of the venturi effect, the gas rises and the pressure rises, and then that triggers something in the pump and it turns off automatically. It's the same effect that gets used in the wine glass, and I love connections like that. Because to me, that takes this very distant, esoteric thing, physics and fluid dynamics and things that sound really scary, and it makes it very real and immediate and something that's pertinent to our own experience. And I never would have been able to make those connections without the blog. There's not really a market for that in straight news reporting. But there
Jennifer,
is.
can I ask you about that?
Yes.
So what I was wondering when I looked at your blog, it sounds like you really use the blog almost like a notepad to sort of sketch things out. So you don't think of it as a way to connect with an audience somehow? It's more just like, this is what I'm into today.
Well, it is about connecting with an audience in the sense that I am ultimately a storyteller and I like to tell stories, and I love being able to share this cool stuff that I've discovered, particularly for people who used to be like, I think, my former self. So yeah, it is about connecting with people, but I've never been one of those blogs that has like 150 comments. I don't do controversial topics very often. It tends to be more, wow, this is really awesome and different, and let's explore this.
Yes, I think one of your recent posts, just to give you the flavor, is on why woodpeckers don't get headaches, I think was...
Right, and I tied it into football concussions.
Right.
Because essentially the scientists who've been studying why woodpeckers don't get headaches has been looking at the biomechanics of the structure of their head, and they've come up with a synthetic material that they think will help cut down on concussions if they can use it in football helmets and things like that.
Photons and Paris Hilton, I mean, that's another one. I think one of your more popular...
Right, actually, I was doing something on particle wave duality and Thomas Young's famous double slit experiment.
Yeah, particle wave duality. I instantly think of Paris Hilton. I don't know about you. Why did you make that connection? What was going on there? And you can explain to me what the wave duality is, because I actually don't know. So.
Oh, okay. Well, for probably several hundred years, there was an ongoing debate going on among the physics community, the scientific community, on whether light was a particle or wave, and different experiments kept coming up with different results. So Newton was a particle person, and Christian Huygens was a wave person, and this kept going until I guess probably about like 1901, when they figured out it was both. And a man named Thomas Young had done this one double slit experiment where he basically blocked, a beam of light and then saw what happened on a screen. And if you get like a diffraction pattern, if you get an interference pattern, then it's a wave, and if you don't, then it's a particle. And what was discovered when people in the early 20th century started reenacting this was what you see depends on how you set up the experiment. So if you measure for a particle, you'll see a particle, and if you measure for a wave, you'll see a wave. And the conclusion, of course, is that light is both. That it is both particle and wave. It just depends on how you're looking at it. I did a blog post about this because there had been a physics paper that was making the rounds, and I just figured there is no way the average person is going to understand why this paper is significant if they don't really understand about Thomas Young's famous experiment. So I did the background post to the news story, essentially. And because I wanted, to have like a fun little human experimenter doing a modern day version of this experiment, I brought in Paris Hilton. because it was ironic. I mean, I also found like a photo of her reading The Art of War and with glasses and looking very studious. So and at the end, of course, she does the experiment and her head explodes. And that, I think, that alone, I think, is why that post was popular.
I see, okay.
Nowadays, I'd probably use one of the Kardashians.
I think, I see the vein that you're working here. But okay, so not to dwell on photons and Paris Hilton unduly, but is this really, this is not a blog that has, 500,000 hits, 3 million. It's not like, it's kind of a salon. It's a large circle of interested people. And you're trying things out.
Right.
Yeah. You're experimenting with, this is experimenting with just your ability to pull off the explanation, your ability to find the material itself. I mean, this keeps you going while you're doing your research, or is this, are you really playing with the pieces here? I mean, do you how many times do you draft a blog post? I mean,
well, in this particular one, I had covered this particular experiment in particle wave duality quite a bit, so I had a pretty good grasp of it, and I wanted to do something different with it, and I wanted to make it accessible to a broader audience, because I think the problem with the coverage, the science press coverage of that particular paper was you only have, 750 words, 1,200, 1,500 tops. How can you get that across? How can you get across the intricacies of what's going on there to someone who doesn't already have at least a little bit of background knowledge? So one way that I think blogs are very, very useful to science journalism, and this is something that we can talk about further, is as a way to kind of augment the limitations of the space limitations of some of the more traditional coverage. You can do the story behind the story kinds of blog posts.
but let's be, crass here for a minute. But this is a huge time-sucking thing, and you're looking things up, you're interviewing people, you're writing stuff, you're coming up with clever analogies, you're tracking down pictures of Paris Hilton, and you're doing this all for free.
Yes.
You're making Arianna Huffington rich, but not you.
Actually, I stopped blogging for Huffington Post for that reason. If I'm
Did you?
going to
good
blog
for
for free,
Good
I'm
for
going to
you.
do it on my own.
Good for you. I would never help Tom Sawyer paint his fence. I'm just not that kind of guy.
It's a kind of counterintuitive thing here, because I actually find that as a result of doing all this work on blogging, I get ideas for pitches, I get ideas for articles. The Calculus book came out of a series of blog posts that I started writing. I started writing them because I figured I'm going to hold myself accountable to my readers.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that, because it's an unusual, I can't imagine walking into a publisher today and saying, I'd really like to write a popular book explaining calculus. I think there's like a lot of people out there who want to read that while they're waiting for their Big Mac.
God bless Penguin for having faith in me. But what happened was I had started looking through these teaching company lectures. Teaching company does these DVD lectures on various topics, and one of them was on calculus. And they're very dry. The guy's very nice, and he does tell a few stories, but I figured if I'm going to really grasp this subject matter, it really helps me to write it out, to talk a little bit about what I'm learning, about this math. And I started looking up a lot of some of the... Wait a minute.
So this is like a slow Saturday, you decide to kill time by watching CDs about calculus?
I had just started dating my future husband, and again, this is culminating.
So you wanted to learn the math so you could keep up your end of the conversation during the date?
Yes.
I see. Okay.
Also to understand, theoretical physics is not like experimental physics. I mean, I really did not understand what he did all day. And so I felt this would be a good way to kind of understand, what my future husband will be doing. And
okay, so we're there with the TV and the remote control, and we're watching the guy.
And I'm taking notes, man.
Okay.
I really am. I'm just.
Wow.
And then I would just basically say, so I've been watching the lecture, and this week I watched these 3 lectures, and here's what I picked up, and here's some interesting things, and here's a question I have. And the nice thing about my blog is a lot of fairly educated people do read it, in addition to like non-physicists. So they actually show up and they correct me and they'll give suggestions. Some of them are more annoying than others about the corrections, but they mean well. And I end up learning a lot from that give and take. And telling little stories, and Jean-Luc Picquant actually had a little calculus adventure in one of them on a road trip where she gets kidnapped and has to figure out, it was, she got kidnapped. and had to use calculus to figure out where she was, because she couldn't, all she could see was how far she'd gone. She didn't know, or it was basically a way of taking a derivative and using an integral to find out where she was.
I mean, of course it was.
And and after a while, I realized, these could almost be a book. English major learns calculus, and because I realized, for me, learning calculus ended up being about making it relevant to my life. It was very boring and dry to me to simply listen to these lectures and just do the problems. But if, and Sean, my husband, was a very big help. He would say, I would say, well, when am I going, what would I use this for? What's this exponential decay curve? What is that relevant to? He goes, well, cup of coffee, cooling, will form an exponential decay curve, which goes down. We got soaked at Space Mountain in Disneyland, and our clothes took forever to dry. And what happens is they dry very, very quickly. The water evaporates very quickly at first. And then as it approaches equilibrium, that rate of change just gets slower and slower. And you get this exponential decay curve. Parabola is a free fall, so we went on a free fall ride. And you can do all these things. Anytime you have a rate of change or adding little bits and pieces up together, you've got a calculus problem. So I loved going out into the real world and finding creative ways to make it relevant. Our house hunting expedition turned into an optimization problem.
Would you like to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, anytime you do any kind of comparison shopping, essentially what you're doing, whether you realize this or not, conceptually you're doing an optimization problem. Housing, I think, is a good example, because you make a list of all the qualities you desire. You're not going to find all of them 100%. So you rank them, you weight them, and you assign a variable to the things that are most important to you. And then you create this little equation, and Sean helped me come up with a little function. And then you plot it out on a curve, and you stick in the values, and it will basically calculate that for you. And then you can find the spots on the curve where that area is optimized, and that's where you look.
And is this how you bought your house?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, because I initially started out just making the old-fashioned way, the pros and cons of each thing, and then my husband said, there's a calculus problem here if you're interested. And I went, am I?
Why? I gotta stop. You're clearly having you're very wonderful explainer. I mean, you're holding our interest with stories about the house, and the kidnapped character is a calculus problem of location. But I mean, what's driving this desire to explain?
I think it's I've always had a natural curiosity. I mean, I'm interested, and I'm curious to want to find out. And I think the key here is that I want to take people with me, because I feel that particularly my teens and early 20s, when I didn't really appreciate science, I kind of feel I got robbed. I kind of feel like this is this wonderful world that I didn't get to experience in my younger years. And there are some people who will never experience that world. A lot of people in this country will never, ever understand that science is actually everyday. Calculus is all around them. They're soaking in calculus all the time, but they think it's something they only learn in high school and then they can forget. So to bring people with me on that journey of discovery, I mean, I think if you have a naturally curious bent, which I do, which I think anyone who goes into journalism does, science writing is wonderful, because I get to learn something new every single day.
Just to follow up. So in journalism, science journalism, we spend a lot of time doing what you're doing, maybe not as well as you do it, but we spend a lot of time on these translational efforts. And the crisis of confidence in journalism is the audience really there to appreciate that? And I think for some topics it definitely is, but calculus, that's a tough call, no matter how beautifully you do it. And so, I guess I'm wondering whether you have a sense that ultimately a significant share of your audience really knows this stuff already. And is just passionate about it and admires, your skill in translation, as opposed to actually reaching people who didn't know this stuff and are learning about it, being drawn in by your magnificent efforts.
Well, there's a little bit of that. There's always going to be a little bit of that. There's always going to be a little bit of preaching to the converted. And I think there are people who do appreciate my writing, but there are also, people who are very scientifically literate who think I'm trivial, I've been called fluffy on more than one occasion. But I also know that I do reach some people, and obviously I'm dealing with because they write me. And they're people who would never in a million years have picked up a book about physics or calculus, and they saw me interviewed or on some show or heard me on NPR or stumbled upon my blog, and were interested. And that makes it worth it. I mean, obviously, I write about the toughest stuff you can, really. Physics and calculus are about the toughest cells. I mean, advanced topological mathematics might be the other thing that you absolutely could not.
Well, I think it's true, because physicists can write about their own stuff, and they can, I mean, look at Brian Greene. I mean,
Brian Greene's wonderful.
Well, he's wonderful, but he can write about stuff that doesn't exist, and it's fine, you know, and it's, because he's a physicist, but mathematicians, I think, are the hardest slog.
Yeah, you can do it, but I actually have discussed this with some people who said, well, you know, my field, you just could never do it. And I went, you could. It's going to take 20 minutes just to convey the basics of what you do to someone, just the broad picture, because you've got to build it piece by piece. But it can be done. Then the question is, how do you get people, as you say, who are not already interested in science to listen to you? And it is tough. But they do, and I think you have to look at it, you know, I'm never going to probably be on the, you know, I'm never going to sell like 1 million copies of the Calculus Diaries, but it's doing surprisingly well, considering it's got calculus in the title. And I think it's because it has zombies in the subtitle.
Yeah, yeah. How did you pick the title? You clearly you have a flair for the
you know, initially
marquee juxtaposition of...
Yeah, initially I kind of wanted to call the book Dangerous Curves because, you know, there's all these curves,
Very nice,
the mathematical functions. But it was a little too high concept, I think, and Penguin basically likes the Calculus Diaries better, even though I said the minute you put calculus in the title, sales are just going to be cut in half. I'm just telling you now. You know, at least with Dangerous Curves, they'll pick it up thinking it's porn.
Well, you know, that's a...
And so I felt it was very important to have a subtitle, you know, that would get their attention. And, you know, probably the most fun chapters were the Vegas chapter, because it was all about probability theory and learning craps in Vegas. And zombies, you know, epidemiology, population dynamics, always fun. And everybody wants to lose weight. And it's interesting, when I was on the Craig Ferguson show, and I was on a local San Diego morning show, and both times, both Ferguson and that other host had the exact same reaction. The Calculus Diaries, ew, calculus. And then they'd read the subtitle and go, oh, well, now I might actually read this. And that's what you're up against. You're up against that initial, ew, physics, ew, calculus. And you've got to bring a sense of play and a sense of fun. And if you do that, I think you have a shot at getting new audiences.
You know, science, oh, sorry, please, I couldn't see because of the light. Go right ahead.
So with the book, you kind of have the luxury of like space where you kind of build on earlier concepts. When you have your magazine articles, how do you kind of tackle that same problem where you can't necessarily explain everything in that short space?
Yeah, that's actually, I've come up with an interesting strategy for that because it does happen. And I was telling Lee, I did a piece for Discover, I think in November, on poker playing physicists and game theory, essentially, probability and game theory. And that story ended up being, the draft ended up being 3,700 words, 4,000 words. You can't, it's a 2,200 word feature in a magazine. So a huge amount of it just got cut. And you don't have the space. I mean, print is, you know, it's a valuable real estate. So I ended up turning that into a blog post. I did all the outtakes and the stuff that I didn't have, didn't have room for in the article for space reasons, put that in the blog. And then through Twitter and Facebook, when the article came out, said, here's this article, and by the way, if you want some backstory, here's the stuff that didn't make it in. And it also got picked up by NPR, so as a result, we got some extra, you know, stuff out of that. But that's another, I think, element of where this new journalism ecosystem can be valuable. I think Ed Young of Not Exactly Rocket Science has started doing, you know, posting transcripts of the actual full interview, because he gets so much good stuff in the interview, and he can't put it all in like a 1,500 word article or features. So he'll end up doing like a full Q&A so people can actually see the context. And that gives you two things. It gives you a nice transparency. You can actually see if he, you know, misquoted someone because the transcript's right there. And it also gives you a little bit more of the behind the music, VH1 behind the music touch to it, where you can actually get some of the backstory. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that as we go on, because
When you say backstory, do you mean backstory or you just mean more?
some backstory. You can do anything you want with it. If something got cut, you can put the outtakes in if you want to actually give the full interview when you only use like 1 or 2 quotes. You can actually, if there was an adventure you had that wasn't relevant to the story, but it was while you were doing the story, you could do a little personal tale of what it was like to do the legwork. You can do anything you want.
Okay, let's linger on this for a second, if you don't mind. So this original piece was concocted as a chapter for Calculus Diaries, yes?
Wow.
About explaining probabilities, and you had the idea to go to
Right.
Vegas. Tell us a little bit about that. if
Yeah,
you-
we had.
I mean, how do you decide, let's make a road trip, of course, calculus, a road trip.
Well, actually,
absolutely.
we were already big Vegas fans. I do play poker. My husband is really into poker, and that's how I figured out that there were just a whole bunch of physicists who love poker.
I see.
They actually
Okay,
play tournament
okay.
poker. So I was already kind of plugged into that. In a sense,
Okay.
I've been doing the research for 3 years.
All right.
And when I was looking for...
Do you win?
Sometimes. I tend to do more lower stakes, and I do quite well.
I see.
Sean does this. So again, sometimes he wins really big, and sometimes he loses, and he usually ends up making money, but over the long haul. But poker is a little too complicated for the chapter in the book,
Okay.
for the Calculus Diaries, so I ended up focusing on craps, which meant I had to go to Vegas and
All right.
make an arrangement with the New York casino and work with one of their dealers, and they brought us into a craps
So
class.
this is very premeditated, but
Yeah.
you've already done a whole lot of work on poker,
Yeah.
which is now lying fallow.
Right, but the basic concepts, the probability concepts are the same.
Right.
They're just more complicated because you're dealing with 52 cards and different combinations and things like that. It's a very complicated
Yeah, but you
game.
have leftovers, I guess is what
Exactly,
I'm
I
getting.
had leftovers.
So what do you do?
I pitched it to Discover Magazine as a magazine article right about the time the book was coming out, and they said, oh, that sounds great, it's a nice
So
little...
you say you pitch it to Discover. You pitch it to Discover as a kind of pseudo excerpt, or
No.
how does that work? How
as
does
a-
that pitch work?
It was as a feature article. I says, this didn't have room for this in the book, but it's kind of amusing. There's why is it that so many physicists are fascinated by poker? And that kind of became, the thrust of the article. And then within that, I got to talk about probability theory and game theory, because those were the two aspects that actually drew physicists to the topic. They loved the strategy, they loved the game theory, they loved the math. And the fact that math actually wasn't enough. You couldn't just crunch numbers. You actually had to have a certain amount of psychological and game theory strategy. It's just something that was, just makes a physicist light up, just gets him addicted. He loves those kinds of complex problems, or she.
So for the poker piece, did you have a character? What was your through line?
My what?
Your through line. What was your narrative spine? Was this the story of Professor Ouellette loses big at Vegas because she doesn't understand game theory, or is it just is it the theory itself? I mean,
it's actually
you're so explanatory. I'm really trying to kind of
right.
get
Well,
at this.
the notion of this particular piece was this trend that I basically, if you've got one poker-playing physicist, it's an
Okay.
anomaly. If you've got
Okay.
two, it's a coincidence. If you've got three, you might actually be onto something. And I found like 8. And that's just the people I interviewed, and that there's at least a dozen more. So then I thought, okay, this is a trend, and I want to understand what it is about it that draws them to this. And I was able to weave bad beat stories in there. You got to have at least one of those, because sometimes, no matter how much the numbers are in your favor, there's always that chance that someone's going to beat you.
Okay, so you began as a set piece for a book. This is kind of backwards, I think, from how things often work. Set piece for a book, which turned into outtakes, which you
Right.
were able to
It
kind of
turned out-
recraft
yeah,
into
It turned out there was a way to spin it, a way to frame
magazine article, but
Yeah.
that then turned into more outtakes that you then turned into the blog.
it. Right.
And
that-
this filtered down into your Twitter feed?
And it filtered into Twitter, into Facebook as well. So what I like about that example is it kind of shows everything coming together. It doesn't always happen that way, but the blog gave rise to the book gave rise to the poker article gave rise to another blog post, which gave rise to an NP article, and it all went out over Twitter and Facebook. And that's where we're going. That's the environment, I think, that we're all going to be dealing with in the future. That you're going to have all these different elements. And rather than looking at them as somehow competing with each other, look at them as working together, as being different aspects of what you do. One of the things that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about is what's appropriate for the Twitter feed, what's appropriate for Facebook, what do I put on my blog, what do I save for an article or a book. I actually really do strategize a little bit about that, and I've given some thought as, you know, and developed.
How so? That's interesting.
You know, through using it, through understanding these new tools and playing with them a little bit, you kind of get a sense for what works. And I found that Twitter is terrible for having any kind of lengthy discussion or thread going, because it just gets 140 characters. What happens is people get offended, you know, you end up getting into fights with people because you only have 140 characters and you can't be clear. It's good at helping you like distill, you know, so it's a good exercise in that, but it's great for fun links and little asides and joking with your friends and having a community going. And Facebook is probably a more in-depth, more private version of that. But there you've at least got a comment thread. You can actually have discussions on Facebook. What I've been noticing is that more and more, because I link to my blog posts on Facebook, people stopped commenting on the blog and now they're commenting on Facebook. I don't know why. It's a very interesting shift. And I'm watching that very closely because I think it's going to change what blogs might end up being.
Okay. But are these all ways of avoiding doing your homework? I mean, you know, yes, tweeting is good. I mean, I do it. I don't blog because I think blogging's too much work. I mean, to do a good blog, that's a real time sucker.
Well, I only do it once or twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I brought in co-bloggers. I didn't want to spend quite as much time with blogging. When I was first starting out, I think it was very useful. I think I blogged 3 times a week, 3 or 4 times a week. It's a lot. For the length of posts that I do, they're usually over 1,000 words.
That's long. I mean, for a blog, that's very long.
I do write fairly long form. And because for me, that's what's useful about it. But that was because I was really trying to work things out then and really trying to find my voice. And now, you know, now I do it to keep my hand in. I do it to keep my name out there. I find that there's useful things that the blog can do for me, but I'm less concerned with having something every 3 days or every 2 days or something like that. You do have to, I think, you've got to make time to write. It's true. It can be a time suck.
So how do you manage that?
Well, you know, you find your routines. I mean, I tend to do a lot of my social networking in the morning. That's when I check my email. You wake up, you have your coffee, you check your email, you check Twitter, you check Facebook, you read your feeds. You know, about an hour, hour and a half I spend on that. If there's any interviews, I'll do those in the morning. You know, at some point I'll go work out and then, you know, might do, you know, a short blog post. But mostly I do my writing in the afternoons and evenings. And the longer blog posts I tend to work on over the weekend. So. And
again, we're still back in the realm of free. How do you?
I have regular, you know, I write regularly for Discovery News, and that's a paid gig.
Right.
And I have a couple of other, you know, minor nonprofit things, and I do the occasional magazine article, and then, you know, the books you do bring in, you know, modest, but you know, they do bring in some advance money.
Well, I don't mean to dwell on it, but,
yeah,
we do have bills, and so far, like the great sort of business model of like digital media is it's free.
Yeah, and that
so our free labor. I mean, our free labor. You know.
Yeah, and that is actually an issue.
But you seem to be making it work, which is why I'm hassling you about it. So.
Well, because I think because, you know, I don't do a lot of original interviews for the blog. Those tend to be background sorts of things. I think if I'm going to go to all the trouble of interviewing, you know, 3 or 4 sources and adhering to journalistic standards, I'm getting paid. I'm going to do all of that.
Well, it's an interesting, I mean, so I'm a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, and they basically own the contents of my brain. So I don't have to kind of really think a lot about how do if I have something really, if I come up with something really good, you know, do I keep it in here and not tell my blog people about it, or do I not? I mean, it's a news story, or it's a project I'm working on, and it just goes to the journal. And when I tweet, or when I contribute to one of our blogs or something, it's in the same spirit. It's all going into the same furnace. But if I were on my own and didn't have all the various parts of my cerebral cortex trademarked, I would be kind of chary about like, oh wow, I just came up with such a great way of saying that. And do I want to throw that in my blog? Because the way things are now, you can get in trouble for plagiarizing yourself, even if you're just kind of trying out phrases and things. I mean, I would.
You can get in trouble really for plagiarizing yourself.
Oh, sure.
Oh, wow.
Sure. Yeah, I don't mean big trouble, but yeah, people will get snarky about it.
I think it's kind of counterintuitive.
There's a New York Times, a former New York Times reporter who lost his job for getting in trouble with his name. I won't give, but he was famous for using the phrase, "She wore her blue collar like velvet." He was a Southerner, and he liked this one, and he used it at every paper that he used to work for. Oh yeah, and there was a little club that used to sort of mail clips of his around with this phrase circled back and forth across the United States at different newsrooms. So with you know, Google and search, and there are just people out there who just sort of do this, and deservedly so. But I would worry about placing something prematurely in a form that I couldn't monetize. There, it's a good Wall Street Journal phrase.
Monetize.
Couldn't monetize, yeah.
You know, I think
Do you hold yourself back?
No. No, I actually...
Should you?
I don't know. I find that...
That great story about Sean and you and the oceans and the Fourier transforms, it's such a wonderful
that was part of our...
essay, punchline, joke,
that
hoo-ha.
showed up on the blog.
Really?
And in a slightly different format than it appeared in the book. But it was after we got engaged, we announced, because we met through our blogs, we announced our engagement on our blogs, and I told that story. And so the Fourier transform joke got quoted in Nature and, you know, various little things like that. I don't see it as, you know, I mean, does a comedian have to, like, you know, hold back on his punchlines?
Well, and the answer is no, but if they're going to do the Carson show, they can only use those jokes, or excuse me, I'm dating myself, Ferguson or whomever, they can only use those jokes once. Then they're gone.
Well, that keeps them on their toes to
Yes,
come
it
up
does.
with something
Yes, it
better
does.
next.
Yeah,
I would like to think that I do not have to recycle the same phrase over and over and over again. I would like to have new stories, and one of the reasons that I think I have the blog is it pushes me to constantly come up with those new stories.
Right, but it's also a reasonable thing that as writers we have until now lacked the opportunity to try stuff out, to hone your material, to do the equivalent of like the stand-up comic who gets to
go to small clubs and try out his
make
material.
an ass out of himself.
Yeah, and actually that's a very good analogy, because I think that is what the blog is for me. It's basically where I try out my stand-up.
Yeah, and I don't mean to beat the blog into the ground, but you know, we can all blog. We can't all necessarily right off the bat have the opportunity to write a book. So that's why I'm lingering here a little bit. I'm curious
But
now.
I also think there's a lot of bloggers that have ended up getting book deals because of their blog.
You
and,
think
and
so?
certainly, you know, Ed Young, I don't mean to, you know, keep raising the specter of Ed Young.
Well, he's very well regarded. I mean,
He gets very self-conscious about it. But he's a wonderful example. I mean, he made a name for himself by writing this not exactly rocket science blog. And, you know, he made it, a blog can pretty much be whatever you want to be. His is very, very professional. I mean, he has citations and, you know, does a lot of research blogging of new papers. And because of all that, he's developing a very, very nice career as a science writer. And he never sleeps. He does it in his spare time at the moment. But he's going to get a book deal. He's going to have a wonderful book one of these days. And it'll be because he raised his profile by doing this blogging. I do think it's a big problem, the idea of monetization.
okay,
So,
and a big problem which way?
I think that at some point we're going to have to come up with a business model where, you know, the people who are doing a lot of this get paid a living wage, or we're going to lose an entire generation of science writers. I feel bad for people like Ed. You know, he's a young guy. He's not getting any sleep. He's got a day job, and he's writing the evenings and weekends this award-winning blog. He's just going to keel over from exhaustion one of these times. You can do it when you're young, and you can make a name for yourself, but I think I worry about what's going to happen to investigative journalism. I worry about the fact that people seem to not value what some of these writers are doing. The ones that really take the time to write their blogs with true journalistic, to meet the professional standard of journalism, not mine. You know, I want to emphasize again, mine is just really a free write. they should be paid for that. They should find a way to be compensated. It's getting harder and harder to do that. I don't think we've found a business model. The number of people who
Yeah, but I think the reassuring thing is that nobody's found a business model. I mean,
No, yeah.
everybody is, that playing field is so level that News Corps and you know, are in the same boat. And that the
Right.
solution that they come up with will probably be a solution that works for you too. I mean, what's one of the things that's so encouraging, small e, but encouraging about this
Right.
iPad app publishing possibility? I mean, there are a lot of,
Yeah,
it changes the cost of entry, among other things.
Right. There's a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting
Indeed,
times.
indeed,
We're
yeah.
living in a very interesting time
Yeah,
where, you know,
yeah.
pretty much the entire way we've done things for as long as I can remember is in flux. And you know, I'm basically, you know, out there and playing with all the new tools and trying to keep abreast and trying to be as flexible and adaptable as possible because I don't know where it's going to go. I would like to give everybody, you know, some really, you know, some sharp wisdom here, but I don't think anyone knows at this point. I can see trends developing.
Such as?
Well, like I said, I'm watching my comment section move to Facebook from my blog. So social networking is actually, I don't want to like, someone just wrote a piece about the death of blogs, which I think is nonsense. But I do think blogs are changing in light of social networking. And we are basically seeing, you know, some subtle shifts in the ecosystem there. What goes on, you know, there are things that go on Twitter. There's now these little short mini blogs or micro blogs called
Right.
Posterous and Tumblr.
Right, now it's interesting, now you've talked about a number of different techno tools, and there are quite a number of them you just haven't mentioned at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that don't seem to fit.
Well, they
you
don't
know.
fit my model, but they fit other people's. I mean, I think several science writers find Posterous and Tumblr, you know, very nice for short things that, you know, maybe don't fit on their themed blog. But I find that I don't really have a need for that just yet. I might in the future. Right now, I don't really, it's just not something I need. But it's nice to know the tool is there, you know, if I do end up needing it. There's some other, you know, different little tools out there that, there's a timeline tool called Dippity that Ed's been playing with and a couple of other science writers.
Yes, another like hugely labor intensive.
Yeah, I haven't played with
So
that yet.
I want to kind of change the subject just slightly here, if you don't mind. So I've got this picture of you in your pajamas, first thing in the morning. You're checking your RSS feeds. You're reading. You're doing your blog. You're tumbling. I guess have an hour. So I mean, how do you discipline yourself to write a book? I mean, what's your routine? How does that work?
I turn off the airport. Seriously,
Ah.
I unplug. I actually will
unplug.
turn off the airport and I will basically have like this writing thing. For the next 2 hours, I'm going to write, and then I'll take a break and I'll spend 15 minutes seeing what I missed, checking my email, that sort of thing, and then I'll go back to writing. You have to do that because if you do, and actually they have an app if you don't have the discipline to turn off the airport on your own. Peter Sagal, the NPR host, uses this to get his writing done, where it'll basically, you set a time limit and say, lock me off the internet, lock me out of the internet for the next 3 hours. And it will not let you surf the internet for the next 3 hours, so you're kind of forced to do your work. You do have to have a certain amount of discipline, I think. So that's what I do. I turn off the airport. I turn off the internet. Otherwise, yeah, you'll end up doing social networking all day. Am I right?
Right, yeah. So is it enough to turn it off for an hour is part of what I'm wondering. I mean,
Oh, I'll do it. I need at least 2 hours. I need at least a 2 hour chunk where I'm not going to get anything done because you need that 15 minutes to get in the zone and, you know, get moving and that sort of thing. So I usually give myself 2 or 3 hours of offline.
How organized are you?
Pretty well organized. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm always thinking I could be more efficient and more organized, but compared to a lot of freelancers, I think I have a pretty good set routine.
I mean, set routine. So I mean, you have like a huge number of calculus, cross-indexed, explanatory, historical files, all on. What are you, a PC person or a Mac person?
I'm a Mac person.
On FileMaker, all color coordinated.
I'm
and
not quite that
cool
organized, but I
fonts
do
and-
have, you know, several.
Or do you have a big stack of preprints on the floor that you kind of kick around?
I actually have, I keep most of my fodder files electronically under various different headers.
Fodder files.
Fodder files.
Yeah, like.
Interesting things that I see on the web that I think, don't know what this is going to be used for, but I think it's going to
I
be
mean,
relevant.
anecdotes and things like that? I mean,
Cool news stories, anecdotes, funny videos, because those can sometimes liven up a blog post, you know, that sort of thing. Anything that I think might at some point be fodder.
Mm-hmm.
Because think of what you do when you write. You take in a whole bunch of elements and you just kind of let it simmer a bit and mix it up, and then you pick out the things that kind of seem to go together.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a very interesting exercise. It keeps me sharp. It keeps me making some of these unusual connections.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to keep them electronic. Otherwise, my entire office would be nothing but files.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
How do
and
you
then-
find them when you need them?
Well,
I mean, how does that work for you?
I actually go through my fodder file every couple of months and clean it out. You know, sometimes I end up not throwing out about half of it because I figured, well, it's been 3 months. I'm probably not going to use that. I do regular, you know, cleaning out. It's kind of like spring cleaning. I do it with my books too. I just occasionally just go through and like clear stuff out. And when I'm ready to write something, then I actually like printouts. I like to have notes in front of me. I like to have a little bit of paper so that I can kind of start mixing and matching. You know, like I need this here and this here and this here, and then I can kind of see it take shape, and then I can write.
Do you have a set routine about how you set up? I mean, you know, I think, you know, the John McPhee school of nonfiction writing is kind of like an obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, every fact gets its own little card, it's on a board, you pin them up, you rearrange them.
That's actually never worked for me.
Yeah.
I end up getting so caught up in the little cards and the facts that I end up never getting around to writing. You know, TK is my favorite thing, because if there's a fact that, you know, I need to look up at some point and go through my notes, I'll just put TK. But I think that for me, I want to do like a free write first, and I want to get that spontaneous freshness to the prose. I actually want to paint the scene, and I want to kind of try it on my own and get that kind of conversational tone. And then I'll take it to the next level in the second draft and refine a little bit more. But if you don't have that immediacy and that freshness, at least for me, it's hard for me to get it later on. I end up getting so focused on the facts and not making a mistake and getting it right that I forget about the storytelling aspect. So I tend to try and write the scenes and then do the explication very, very carefully and fit it in around that. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. So do you outline compulsively? What do you do?
I do have outlines. I think I do. I would say that I definitely outline. I'll do a document and I'll say, well, this is going to go here and here and here. That doesn't always end up being the way. Sometimes when you start writing, you find that actually this piece works better somewhere else. But generally, I need a place to start. And I need to know I'm going somewhere, and I need some sort of framework to work within.
So, well, I'm listening to you, and I'm listening to you talk about how you work, and actually, it all sounds very collaborative. I mean, you have a blog, but it's not your blog. You have a blog with a group. You are using Twitter to not just announce things, but to actually talk to other people. I'm wondering what your relationships with your editors are like, particularly given the kind of thing you do. I mean, can you sit down with your editor? You said Penguin, right? Penguin?
Yes.
And have a happy chat about derivatives?
Yeah, actually. In fact, I'm meeting with my editors tomorrow to talk about the next book. And I like the fact that at this point, after 3 books, they trust me enough, you know, that we'll be able to sit down and say, okay, you know, here's the idea we're leaning towards. Can we flesh this out? And here's what I'm thinking. And do you have any suggestions? There's a lot of give and take. I like having a conversation with my editor. And I think even when you're writing for magazines, that's important. You need to be able to be very clear, you know, from the outset where your story is going. You need to know what you and your editor need to be on the same page. If, as in the case with the poker-playing physicists, I started writing and realized this is going to be a much bigger story, I want to feel comfortable enough to go to my editor and say, it's becoming longer, and here's why, and I'm worried I might not be able to do justice to it. Can I get a little more space? And the answer is either going to be yes or no, and you'll deal with it. But I liked the fact that Corey Powell at Discover said yes.
You're very much clearly an exponent of outreach. And you had an experience I'd like to hear a little bit about, where for a couple of years, till recently, you were engaged in this enterprise for the National Academy of Sciences, the Science and Entertainment Exchange. I wonder if you'd kind of tell us a little bit about that, because that's a kind of a side of outreach that science writers don't normally get into, actually trying to foster collaborations between the entertainment industry and the
And the
science.
Right.
How did that come about? What is it about? How did it work?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I basically took 2 years off from my writing career, apart from writing the book on evenings and weekends, to run this program because I just thought it was so innovative and so unusual. We all, you know, it's popular on the web, particularly, to poke fun at bad science in film and television. And it's all, I've engaged in it. I also wrote a book on the physics of the Buffyverse, you know,
Right.
so I kind of like that intersection of science and popular culture anyway. But the idea here is that there's always going to be a certain amount of liberties that are going to be taken, you know, in film and television, because it's all about the story and the narrative, and you're telling a story. It's not about explication. But you can use that to inspire people to want to learn more. And if you put writers, producers, directors directly in contact with scientists and put them in a room together and let them brainstorm plot points, you end up with a better product on both sides. You end up with more realistic depictions of scientists, or at least more, you get more realistic depictions of scientists. You get better science. You get some really surprising plot points. You know, the example that I give.
Can you just explain to us for a second, kind of, just mechanically how this worked? I mean,
Well, say
you took an ad out in Variety. I mean,
you're a screenwriter, and you're working on this pilot episode or a spec script for this TV show, and you have a plot that you've kind of outlined, and you're stuck. It's got a scientific topic, you know, stem cells, forensics, something. You're trying to get from point A to point B in the plot. And you think you've come up with something, but it's not quite working, it doesn't really sound quite right. So you run it past a scientist. You sit down with a scientist, they read the draft, and they say, no, you actually can't do that. It's not enough to just point out where they're wrong. And I think that's a mistake that scientists often do. They just wag their fingers and say, that's bad science, naughty screenwriter, no biscuit. And, but if you then say, but you know, you probably might not be aware, but there's this other avenue of research that really isn't very well known outside of scientific circles, and I think it could really work here. I think that you could actually take this paper and rework it in such a way that you get a plausible plot point that's fresh and new, and that, you know, the average person doesn't even know about, and it will make your story better and more plausible and also more innovative. And just that process of getting to know each other, I think a scientist getting to know a screenwriter is going to understand why Hollywood makes the decisions it makes a little bit better, and vice versa. So I ended up doing that for a couple of years, and it turns out that same quality I have of being able to pick lots of different things out and bring them together was a very useful skill, because I had to, I just never knew what I was going to get from the Hollywood side. I mean, they would want someone, you know, who was, you know, a forensics expert, particularly in ballistics, or the best one was they wanted an expert in the star-nosed mole. It turns out there is only two.
an expert in the star-nosed
an animal
mole.
called the star-nosed
Yeah, I know
mole, and there was only two. They needed someone local, and there was nobody local. So, but I did manage to convince them to fly out the one expert in Virginia.
Why did they
well,
need
because
an expert in
they
the
were doing it. They were
star-nosed
doing a piece. I think City of Ember had a big monster, and that monster had a huge sucker on its face, and that was based on the star-nosed mole.
Ah, okay.
This was on the science behind that.
Right there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, in this interaction between the script writers and scientists, is it usually the script has already a scientific point or theme or character, or are scientists also sort of jumping in and saying, oh, this would be a perfect point to put in this little tidbit about diabetes because this character has a health problem, or sort of does the interaction go both ways, or is it mostly scripters looking for advice on how to incorporate it?
I think it's more them looking for advice. When we first started the program, obviously all the queries that we got were from sci-fi, because that was the obvious thing. And as we became more well-known and we made more connections, people realized that actually, you know, science comes up a lot in scripts. And if you look at television right now, half the cop dramas on there deal in some form with science. There's medical dramas, there's forensics, you know, the CSI effect is very, very real. And then you have the Big Bang Theory, which is the #1 comedy, which is all about physicists, PhD physicists. So science on prime time is actually happening a lot now, so this was a very good time to be doing this. that's usually what it is. But that process of them talking, I think, really does help the creativity on both sides. I've actually had scientists be surprised at the kinds of questions that a Hollywood person will ask, because I think scientists get used to journalist-type questions. What was your experiment? What was your result? What was your protocol? That sort of thing. Hollywood doesn't ask the expected questions. They ask extremely unexpected things like, well, yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, what if you took that and you put it in this completely weird situation, and what would happen then? And often there's no good answer to that, and the scientist ends up being challenged. I think that they ended up being really intrigued, so the interactions I found have been very, very interesting.
I actually have another question about the interactions between the screenwriters. What makes the screenwriters want to get the science right? Like, what is their motivation? Do they have people coming in and saying, no, that's wrong?
It's pride in your work, among other things. I think there's this idea that, people in Hollywood they love science. They're slightly intimidated by it, and who could blame them? But they actually are big. There's a lot of smart people working in there. They love science. Half of them read New Scientist and Wired and all these various things looking for ideas for their shows. And and the reason they do is because it adds an element of plausibility. When you think about what you're trying to do in fiction, in a fictional TV show, you've got to play into the willing suspension of disbelief. The audience you're going to lose your audience if there's any moment where they think, wait a minute, could that really happen? That doesn't really sound quite that right. And even though the audience might not have a degree in science or anything, they can tell when you're BSing. And the screenwriters know that. The good screenwriters know that they actually have to know their stuff. And they end up with a better show, they end up with a better story, and the audience buys it a little more quickly. Their world that they're creating is that much more believable. Does that answer your question?
Just to follow up on that. Those of us who write about what Lee would call the easy sciences,
None of them are easy.
We spend a lot of time sort of trying to figure out how to communicate big picture environmental issues, and climate would be the classic example. And there's incredible amounts of angst still being spent, especially over the last 3 or 4 years. Why people don't get it, what should be happening in entertainment, blah, blah, blah. Do you see that issue as fundamentally different from the kinds of issues that you communicated, when you were working with the Academy? Or is there something different about that? Where does the denialism on that issue, how is it fundamentally different than, let me ask you a different way.
Yeah.
Why are people willing to suspend disbelief on physics, when they won't have climate science?
That's a really good question.
Some people won't suspend their disbelief on physics. The free energy machines are never going to go away. Cold fusion is never going to go away. People are still going to think the Large Hadron Collider is going to destroy the world. We have our own issues in physics, our own series, type of denialism. So it is different. People like narratives. They like stories, and I don't think this is an original insight, but for some reason the climate denialists have just come up with a much more compelling narrative, and they're just kicking the butts of legitimate scientists with it. They know how to sell a message. They know there's a performance aspect to it. They're weaving a story and a narrative, and they have heroes and they have villains. And it taps into this storytelling, this narrative framework beautifully. And one of the reasons I think that the National Academy of Sciences, because they have a lot of interest in climate change, obviously, is interested in tapping into Hollywood. Hollywood has those storytelling skills. So if you can get the entertainment industry with its clout, with its skill at weaving these narratives and swaying perceptions and tapping into people's emotions and getting them to care about these issues, then maybe we can start fighting some of these, hardcore pockets of denialism. Although there's a cognitive psychology aspect to this, so that there's always going to be a small fraction. You're just never going to get them. I mean, if the quote I just read recently is, You can't get a man to see something, to see a fact for what it is, if his entire tribal identity rests on the fact that he can't see it. Because he's not going to give up his tribal identity. And if you've got someone deeply, deeply invested in denying climate change, it's really, really hard to get that person to change their mind. But likability, strong characters, strong narrative, swaying the emotions, those are the ways you do it. And unfortunately, it's the antithesis to the way that we like to do things. I am not that person, or I like to think that I'm not. We like to recite facts. We like to build evidence in cases. What I found actually is that a lot of people actually do not understand what evidence is. Their idea of evidence is, an anecdote, their best friend. It happened to their friend or their cousin or whatever, and that's evidence for them. It's not evidence for a scientist. How do you overcome those gaps? And I think that the Academy is hoping that this program and some other outreach efforts will help merge those two tools. The facts encased in a strong narrative might actually change minds. Does that help? I think that's what you were getting at. I wasn't.
Yeah, I mean,
It's depressing.
the debate, such as it is that there's just something fundamentally different about this issue, perhaps because of the massive social change that it implies. That somehow there's just something different that you don't see in disputes about evolution.
What, climate change?
Yeah.
You see it in the anti-vax movement. You definitely see it in the free energy and cold fusion schemes. Maybe the climate change one is the most impactful.
I think
The scale is enormous, yes.
Well, yeah, and surely you have two different elements. I mean, there is a kind of hardcore creationist-like denialist thing, but surely also we have to acknowledge that the threshold of reform that some climate change scenarios require for civilization as we know it is so high that it becomes one of those extraordinary claims for which extraordinary proof is demanded by even a reasonable person. And that's a tension that actually I think that the scientific community ain't so hot at dealing with. They want a buy-in that then bleeds over into a policy arena. Surely you see this a lot in the environmental area where, a set of scientific conclusions dictates a political change. And different people have different threshold for the political change, even if they acknowledge the chemistry involved.
Right, and then ideally along the way you have these no regrets strategies that you adopt, except in truth a lot of the so-called no regrets strategies that we talk about in climate are not really no regrets. They're big losers associated with some of these. Anyway, sorry for that. I just think it's an interesting discussion about why the cognitive dissonance is there in some areas and not others.
Well, it's interesting because there are people who accept climate change. For example, most of liberal Hollywood, but they also, will deny certain basic aspects of physics. They will misunderstand and misuse quantum mechanics. They will cling to astrology. There was for a long time a huge anti-vaccination movement in Hollywood that was quite popular.
It still is a huge anti-vaccination.
Yeah. So
it really has to do with tribal identity.
Exactly, and this particular tribe accepts climate change and denies a whole bunch of other science.
I mean, there are some strange things, like News Corp, owner of Fox News, is carbon neutral. The first sort of major corporation like that to actually achieve, as an aggressive corporate policy, total and complete carbon neutrality, whatever that means in a day-to-day basis. So it's curious. And of course, I think, and I'd be interested as a science communicator hearing what you think. I think kind of to follow up on what Dan is saying is that science writers now find themselves in a position where in some areas they feel a kind of responsibility for the message.
Yeah.
Climate reporting being a kind of maybe the most important example right now. And that's where you could argue that your role as a journalist and your role as a communicator start to war with each other. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, and that, you're right, there is a certain warring going on because, you know, at some point you've got to sell the science now. And that is not something that most of us are really comfortable with, I think, that concept. But if you've got someone who is resisting the, you know, the facts, you know, how do you present those facts in such a way that you can get your audience to accept them? I'm actually, you know, fond of telling people, well, do you want to be right or do you want to be heard? Because sometimes you can't do both. And, you know, how do you make that choice? It's tricky. But I also think that we've talked about this, you know, science writers in various panels and things about this notion of a false equivalency, of a false balance that shows up a lot, particularly, I think, in climate reporting and some of these things where that's one thing I think that makes science writing different, is that there is, in fact, a right or wrong answer oftentimes here, and it's where the consensus meets. And it's the reporter's job to figure out where that consensus meets and where, you know, and what that is, and to report that, and not to just like pick some lone crazy scientist just because they need balance in their story. If there's a consensus, say there's a consensus, and then focus on the tiny parts where there isn't.
Well, it's tricky because let's be real.
It's very tricky.
We have an appetite. You know, we all pay attention. We're quite scrupulous about not wanting to pay attention to the lone wacko out there, but we have an appetite for the lone wacko over here, who is a little more alarmist and a little more, I mean, whatever the topic is,
Right.
because that drives and I mean this in a sound way, drives the story, drives the headline, drives the sense of urgency.
Right.
So the consensus maybe has got to go both ways.
Right.
I don't
And
know.
it's actually a problem, and I struggle with that on my own. I mean, what do I call myself? A science journalist, a science communicator, an outreach person? Because, you know, over the last 5 years, I've worn a lot of different hats. And still trying to, you know, kind of find that balance. What I basically have to make sure that I do is when I'm writing, you know, a straight journalism piece, that I adhere to, you know, those standards. Those standards, I think, are becoming more important than ever. It's more important than ever that we have journalism programs that train people so that they know what these standards are. Because it's getting so murky and so complicated and confusing out there that, you know, when you are writing this particular kind of writing, you need to know exactly what you should be doing and what the professional standard is.
Right here?
This is sort of moving a bit away from what we were just talking about, but it's tangentially related to the sense that, like, selling the science requires some sort of sense of authority. And I guess my question is, like, as a woman writing about something that's sort of like more physics, engineering kind of thing, do you feel like you have to do different things than men who are writing about the same subjects because it is sort of like a harder science and sort of like a male-dominated field?
It is. I have this tendency to end up in male-dominated fields. I don't know why. I've never felt the need to necessarily be, you know, especially feminine. I think that I have naturally taken a different tack than your standard typical male physics writer, just because I was this whole process of finding my voice. But I've never felt that, you know, I had to write about it a different way because I was a woman. But you do have to sell it, and I look at who I'm trying to sell it to, and generally I'm trying to sell it to people who don't like physics, who are afraid of it, who are intimidated by it, who I think if they knew a little more about it, if it was presented to them the right way, like me, they would fall in love with it. So if I'm tailoring it to anything, it's to that imaginary audience, or very really in my head. That's who I'm picturing. So it's much more story-driven. I try and find cultural links and things, because, you know, or real-world links, and, you know, things that people will recognize where they can tie the physics into something that's familiar to them. But that's the only difference, you know, really. It's not really a gender thing at all. There was someone else?
Yeah.
Hi. I had a magazine for scientists called The Scientist. It's for biologists, and I work there too. And what's interesting is that I work with reporters who are telling the story, but sometimes I think it's harder for them, not harder, but I don't know that they reach the real depth of what a story can bring because they're not doing the science. So I also
I think that's the key. They're not really taught that. And the way you're going to write for a scientific audience in your papers, in your review articles, that sort of thing, is complete worlds apart from how you're going to write in a feature article and telling the story. There are a rare number of scientists who are specialists who can do both. Brian Greene, Jan Levin, those two people come to mind. My own husband comes to mind. But I mean, it's tough. I mean, who's your target audience? I actually think that a good writer can capture that element. They just need to work very closely with translating what the scientist is doing. They need to spend more than a half an hour on the phone with the scientist. You need to visit the lab. You need to maybe spend the day and get kind of the flavor of it. If I'm doing a major feature on a scientist or a profile, I want to meet them in person. I don't want to be doing this over the phone. I want to look at them and see their lab and get a sense for them. Because all of those elements, these tiny little details that help set the scene, you're not going to get those unless you spend that kind of time. And that's getting back to, again, why we need to work on the pay model, because to do a really wonderful in-depth feature like what you're describing takes a huge amount of time. And if you're only paying your writer $300 for this feature, I'm sure you pay more than that, don't get me wrong. But they're not, where's their motivation? I mean, it's not going to end up, you're not going to keep a good writer very long that way. But I do think it's possible. I'm not sure. I think that there are some scientists who naturally have a gift for storytelling, and I think one way around this is that a lot of science writers are starting to come out. They have master's degrees or bachelor's degrees in science, but they aren't necessarily specialists, but they know enough that they have this beat, and they will be able to at least know what questions to ask. So I do think it's possible for a writer to actually gain technical expertise. It can be difficult to teach a scientist to completely switch gears and become a storyteller. I would never say it's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, scientists are taught to communicate. Fortunately for those of us in this room, they're taught to communicate in a way that kind of ruins them for talking to general audiences. I mean, as I'm sure you know, I mean, the rigors of scientific communication publishing are crucial to the progress of science. And it's very specific, and it's beaten into them, materials, methods, this, that, and the other thing. And it just makes it harder to shed that. The American Association for the Advancement of Science for many years has been wrestling with this problem. It's created 20, 30 years ago a media fellows program where they every year bring in groups of either all but dissertation PhD students or people who've just finished their PhD and farm them out to different media outlets. And pretty much the experience of that program has been that it's easier to turn a reporter into a science writer than to turn a scientist into a reporter.
And it's too bad, because I think the world would be a better place if scientists could just talk better.
Yeah, but then we'd be out of jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that another aspect of this is that there are these many different levels that you're going to be targeting, and the scientist targets maybe not a specialist or a technical audience, but a pretty well-versed, a pretty scientifically educated. Maybe they're not specialists and they want to read about what's going on in other fields, but it's much higher than your average USA Today reader, for example. So, I mean, I found that what I do I tend to write more for a general interest audience more and more as the years go on. But I will say, what I said at the very beginning, if you're going to write about calculus, about quantum mechanics, about these various esoteric things in a way that a layperson can understand, and you're going to do this creatively, you actually really got to get in there and know the stuff. Maybe not on the same level that an expert would, but certainly more than a half-hour interview is going to get you. You really got to dig in and drill down and ask a lot of very basic, why is the sky blue kind of questions. And maybe a tiny fraction of that ends up in the article, but it informs all of it. So it can be done.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you really put your finger on it when you talk about the business model, whatever jargon you want to, monetization, whatever you want to call it. But having dealt with ambitious reporters who want to communicate science and ambitious scientists who want to communicate to large audiences for the last 30 years, I know which group is much more likely to succeed. It's obviously the reporters if they have the depth of knowledge. And I think just about everyone has come to that conclusion. On the other hand, we do have these new tools, these web-based tools that for niche audiences can work really well for scientists who are practicing their craft and trying to get broader. Which is why at NYU we run these science workshops for PhD students to teach them to be just that.
Oh, the science.
There's just no context in dealing with the two groups now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The science blogs are an amazing resource, but the more technical you get, the more specific in your field, even though it's very valuable. I mean, I read them because at this point I can follow, at that. That's a tribute to my science education right there. But they will get a smaller and smaller audience the more technical they are. But they're ideal because if you are interested in learning a little bit more in depth in what's in the news story, then the science blogs have really taken up that gauntlet in a really admirable way. You can get some incredible commentary, really in depth. You can get some wonderful analyses of new papers and various things out on the blogs. And it's an incredible resource.
Okay, now in the wake of all of these really important questions, I know a lot of us are really worried about getting jobs and the monetization, especially as students, we just have this 30 minutes on the phone. But even with all that, I'm going to ask kind of fluffy questions.
I love fluffy questions.
Yeah, okay, great. What is the most difficult concept that you've ever had to translate for a general audience? Because I think a lot of people are really intimidated by translating physics and math, and just, what was the hardest thing you ever sought to translate, and how did you do it?
That's a great question.
Non-perturbative theory and the concept of dualities in string theory in physics. This is something that I picked up a little jargon thing. It was when I was writing, believe it or not, the physics of the Buffyverse, and it's such a silly title for a book. And when I was working on this chapter, I started asking all these questions about CP violation and non-perturbative theory, and the physicist I was asking just looked at me and went, "I thought you were writing a book on Buffy the Vampire Slayer." And I went, "It's relevant." Because there's an episode where one of the characters is a string theorist, and it talks about the non-perturbative properties of string theory. And I wanted to define that line. And it took me 1,000 words. But what it essentially is, I had to end up coming up with the idea of making estimates for like a construction project. When you are estimating the costs of a project, you're going to do all these line items, you're going to make a rough estimation, and then as the project progresses and you start getting the real costs, and you can gradually refine your estimate bit by bit. And those little tiny refinements are perturbations. In other words, you get a kind of broad back of the envelope calculation, and then you kind of refine it gradually step by step, and get a little bit more accurate. But those changes are very, very minor. They're not huge fluctuations, so it's called a perturbative approach. And physicists use this all the time. But what happens when you're dealing with something really exotic, like a rotating black hole or a wormhole or something like that, you end up with these huge changes. Rather than having small incremental changes, you have these massive changes, and all your calculations just go to hell. And that's non-perturbative. And what physicists then do is they find a duality. They find a model where they're basically inverse of each other, where something that is a really big fluctuation in one version of M theory will be small in another. They'll calculate that thing in the small one, and then they'll plug it back into the bigger equation. And it's just basically an approach for how they've learned to solve these incredibly complicated calculations. That's the soundbite version. I mean, the book goes into a little bit more detail, but maybe that was a mistake to put it in a book called The Physics of the Buffyverse, but I learned so much from the process of trying to understand what the hell that meant, about how physicists work, about how they use mathematical calculations, and what some of these very esoteric jargon terms actually mean. And you can do it. You can put it into terms that I think the average person can understand if you look at it very, very broadly and come up with good analogies. That was one of the hardest, as you can see.
Well, you've taken us now on a really interesting journey through your work, through the way you think about things. not to mention the journey of the 3,000 miles or so that you made this evening to be with us. I, for one, have just really learned a lot from what I've been hearing, and I just really thank you for the time that you've taken with us and your generosity in sharing the contents of that quantum mechanical thing you have between your ears. And, you know, thank you very much.
Thank you guys for coming.
Now, I encourage you, now that you're talked out and dehydrated, to go have a glass of wine. Please stay, continue the conversation. I think there's some nibbles left. And I remind you that we reconvene on March 22nd, Dan? 22nd? Because when we'll sit down with Joe Palca and National Public Radio and talk to him a little bit about turning sound into stories, into science, making people listen. Thank you again so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. This was fun.